I am Gabby, 35 years old, standing in the marble foyer of a Buckhead mansion, wearing a $5 thrift store coat and holding my newborn son, Elijah. My grandmother looked down at my hollow cheeks and scuffed shoes with absolute disgust. "I gave you $250,000 for that child," she snapped, her voice echoing off the crystal chandelier. "Why are you dragging my great-grandson through this pathetic poverty just to prove some stubborn point?" I did not cry. I simply adjusted the worn blanket around my baby, looked her dead in the eye, and told her exactly why I had to sell my laptop just to pay my hospital copay. Before I tell you how that single sentence destroyed my family, fake empire, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to watch the people who broke you face their own karma. The wind cutting through Atlanta that morning was bitter, but it was nothing compared to the coldness radiating from the imported Italian marble beneath my feet. I stood in the grand entryway of my grandmother Josephine estate, feeling entirely out of place. This was the fortress of Black excellence she had built from the ground up, a sprawling testament to her success in real estate. The walls were adorned with original artwork, the air smelled faintly of expensive vanilla candles, and every surface gleamed with pristine perfection. And then there was me. I was swimming in a faded gray maternity coat I had found at a discount rack 3 towns over. The hem was frayed and the zipper barely worked, forcing me to clutch the fabric tightly across my chest to keep the winter chill away from Elijah. My son was only 3 weeks old, sleeping fitfully against my shoulder, wrapped in a blanket that had seen better days. My hands were shaking not just from the cold of my car, whose heater had broken 2 months ago, but from sheer exhaustion. Every muscle in my body ached with a dull, relentless throb. I had not eaten a proper meal in 3 days. I had survived my pregnancy on a diet of cheap noodles and whatever discounted wilted produce I could find before the grocery store threw it out. I had lost everything. My fiancé Malik, my prestigious career as a financial auditor, my beautiful home, my dignity. All of it had been stripped away by my mother and sister in a calculated, brutal campaign to ruin me. I came to Josephine today as an absolute last resort, swallowing every ounce of pride I had left, because Elijah needed formula, and I had exactly $12 to my name. It took every ounce of strength I had just to walk up her long, sweeping driveway, because the gate guard refused to let my sputtering, rusty car onto the pristine estate grounds. I heard the rhythmic tapping of her cane before I saw her. Josephine descended the grand curved staircase dressed immaculately in a tailored navy suit, her silver hair perfectly styled. Even at 78 years old, she commanded the room with an imposing, terrifying grace. She was the matriarch, the woman whose approval my mother, Vivian, and sister Chloe practically bled to secure. Josephine stopped 3 steps from the bottom. Her sharp eyes swept over me, taking in my sunken face, the dark purple bags under my eyes, and the scuffed toes of my boots. She did not rush forward to embrace me. She did not coo over her new great-grandson. Instead, her features twisted into a mask of profound disappointment and anger. "Gabrielle, what on earth is this display?" she demanded, her voice slicing through the quiet foyer. I had expected harshness, but the sheer vitriol in her tone made me flinch. She descended the final steps, her cane striking the marble with a sharp crack. "Look at you. Look at this child. You come into my home looking like a vagrant. I knew you wanted to be independent. I knew you wanted to prove you did not need this family, but dragging my great-grandson through poverty. This is beyond foolishness. This is neglect." I opened my mouth to speak, but the exhaustion made my tongue heavy. "Grandma," I whispered, clutching Elijah closer. "I need help. I have nothing left." Josephine scoffed, a bitter sound that echoed off the high ceilings. "Stop playing the victim, Gabrielle. It is insulting to my intelligence. I gave you $250,000 to ensure this baby had everything he needed, $250,000, and you stand here in rags begging for handouts. Was the money not enough for you, or did you squander it all to punish us?" The air in my lungs vanished. Time seemed to slow down, the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway suddenly deafening. $250,000. The words echoed in my mind, colliding violently with the reality of my empty bank accounts, the neon pink eviction notices taped to my apartment door. The countless nights I cried myself to sleep because my stomach was cramping from hunger. My mother Vivian and my sister Chloe had told me Josephine wanted absolutely nothing to do with me. They had visited my cramped studio just weeks ago, delivering the news of my excommunication with sympathetic smiles. They claimed Josephine was so disgusted by my supposed financial crimes and my ruined engagement to Malik that she forbade anyone from even mentioning my name in her presence. They sat on my thrifted couch wearing designer clothes and told me I was entirely on my own. A strange sensation washed over me. It was not sorrow. It was not the familiar sting of rejection I had carried my entire life. It was absolute chilling clarity. The final puzzle piece snapped into place, revealing a picture so monstrous, so entirely evil, that it burned away the last remnants of the weak, accommodating daughter I used to be. I did not cry. For the first time in nearly a year, my vision was perfectly clear. I stood up straighter, adjusting my grip on my son. The trembling in my hands completely stopped. I looked my grandmother dead in the eyes. I held her gaze with a steadiness that made her own eyes narrow in confusion. "Grandma?" I said, my voice eerily calm and ringing with undeniable truth. I had to sell my work laptop for $300 just to cover my hospital copay so they would let me take my son home. I am facing eviction on Friday. I have been eating ramen noodles for 6 months because I cannot afford groceries. Josephine opened her mouth to interrupt, but I took a step forward, closing the distance between us. "I never received a single dollar from you," I told her. "Not one dime." The silence that fell over the grand foyer was absolute. I watched the progression of emotions flash across Josephine's face. First impatience, then confusion. Then, as she stared into my hollow, desperate eyes, the horrifying realization struck her. Josephine was a woman who had built an empire by reading people, by knowing when she was being lied to. She knew in that exact moment that I was telling the absolute truth. She did not gasp. She did not scream or place a hand over her heart. Josephine was a predator who had just realized another predator had breached her territory. The icy, terrifying stillness that settled over her features made the cold winter air outside feel warm by comparison. She realized that her own blood, her daughter Vivian, and her beloved granddaughter Chloe had not only robbed her blind, but had actively starved her great-grandson in the process. Without a single word, Josephine turned her back to me. She walked over to the antique console table, picked up her phone, and dialed a number. Her voice when she spoke lacked any trace of the grandmotherly disappointment from moments ago. It was the voice of the ruthless real estate mogul who crushed competitors for sport. "Get my legal team on the line," she commanded into the receiver. "All of them. Cancel my afternoon meetings and get the forensic accountants over here immediately. We have a domestic theft situation." She hung up the phone, turning back to look at me and the baby shivering in my arms. Her eyes softened for a fraction of a second before hardening into pure steel. "Come into the kitchen, Gabrielle," she said, gesturing with her cane. "We are going to feed that baby, and then we are going to burn their lives to the ground." The war had officially begun, and my family had no idea that the very person they tried to bury was about to become the architect of their absolute ruin. I sat in the back of my grandmother's chauffeured town car, watching the Atlanta skyline blur past the tinted windows. My stomach was finally full from the hot meal Josephine had forced me to eat, and Elijah was sleeping soundly against my chest, wrapped in a thick cashmere blanket she had pulled from a guest room. For the first time in months, I felt a flicker of physical warmth. But as the driver navigated the streets toward my cramped, unheated studio apartment, the quiet luxury of the car gave way to the deafening roar of my own memories. I am 35 years old. I am a Black woman who played exactly by the rules society laid out for me. I earned my degrees with honors. I secured a demanding, high-paying position as a corporate financial auditor. I kept a clean record, a spotless credit score, and a quiet, dignified life. By all standard metrics, I was a success story. But in the eyes of my mother, Vivian Washington, I was nothing more than an educated mule. Vivian was a woman entirely consumed by the optics of Atlanta high society. She thrived on charity galas, designer labels, and the breathless admiration of her peers. She viewed her children not as human beings, but as accessories to be worn and displayed to the world. And I, with my practical business suits and long hours analyzing spreadsheets, was an accessory she strongly preferred to keep hidden in the closet. When I passed my grueling certification exams to become a senior auditor, Vivian merely sighed and asked why I chose a profession that required me to hide behind a desk like a glorified calculator. There was never any pride in her voice when she spoke of my career. There was only a thinly veiled irritation that my success did not come with a red carpet or a magazine cover. Then there was Chloe. My younger sister was 32 years old, and she was Vivian's absolute masterpiece. Chloe was undeniably stunning with a magnetic vanity that drew people in and completely blinded them to her profound lack of substance. She was the golden child, the protected investment, the daughter who could do absolutely no wrong. While I was treated as a grim utility, Chloe was celebrated as a fragile treasure. The division of labor in our family was established early and enforced ruthlessly. I was designated as the workhorse. During Chloe's years at Spelman College, I practically earned her degree for her. My phone would ring at 2 in the morning with Vivian demanding I write Chloe's sociology term papers or format her marketing presentations. "Your sister needs her beauty rest for the pageant tomorrow," Gabby Vivian would say, her voice dripping with that manufactured syrupy tone she used whenever she wanted something. "You are so good at typing anyway. It will only take you an hour." If I dared to protest, if I mentioned my own exhausting corporate workload, Vivian would swiftly deploy the guilt. She would call me selfish and bitter, accusing me of trying to sabotage my own sister out of pure spite. So I wrote the papers. I built the spreadsheets. I stayed awake until dawn, making sure Chloe maintained her perfect grade point average. And when Chloe walked across that graduation stage, clutching a degree she barely lifted a finger to earn, Vivian threw a lavish catered party at an exclusive country club. She stood in front of her wealthy friends, raising a crystal glass of champagne, and praised Chloe's natural brilliance and relentless work ethic. I spent that entire party in the background coordinating with the caterers and refilling ice buckets because Vivian told me my dress was not formal enough to mingle in the main dining room. The psychological abuse did not stop at academics. It permeated every single facet of our lives. Whenever Chloe created a disaster, I was immediately summoned to clean up the wreckage. When Chloe backed her luxury sedan into a parked car because she was taking selfies while driving, I was the one Vivian ordered to handle the aggressive insurance adjusters. When Chloe repeatedly overdrafted her bank accounts buying designer shoes and VIP concert tickets, I was the one expected to audit her expenses and quietly cover the deficits so Vivian would not have to face the ultimate embarrassment of a declined card at Neiman Marcus. I was the family crisis manager, the silent fixer. Yet the more problems I solved, the more resentment they harbored toward me. My competence was a constant mirror reflecting Chloe's incompetence, and Vivian hated me for it. She punished me by making sure I knew my place at the bottom of the family hierarchy. I internalized that toxic dynamic for decades. I honestly believed that if I just audited enough high-profile accounts, if I saved enough money, if I proved my unwavering loyalty, Vivian would eventually look at me with the same fierce, protective love she showered on Chloe. I thought my utility would eventually buy my humanity. But systemic abuse does not breed love. It breeds entitlement. Vivian and Chloe did not see me as a daughter or a sister. They saw me as a resource to be mined. And when my resources stopped serving their manicured illusion of wealth, they did not just discard me. They decided to destroy me. As the town car pulled up to the cracked sidewalk of my dilapidated apartment building, the reality of my current squalor hit me with brutal force. I thanked the driver and stepped out into the freezing wind, clutching Elijah tightly against my chest. I was returning to a freezing room with peeling paint and neon pink eviction notices taped to the door, while the women who put me here lived like absolute queens. Walking up the narrow, creaking stairs to my unit, I thought about how Vivian had justified my current living conditions. She told our extended family that I had simply lost my mind, that I was making terrible choices and isolating myself. She spun a beautiful, tragic narrative where she was the heartbroken mother trying to save a daughter who refused to be saved. Unlocking my thin wooden door, I stepped into the tiny room that held everything I had left in the world. A mattress on the floor, a borrowed bassinet, and a stack of unpaid medical bills. I laid Elijah down gently, making sure the cashmere blanket was tucked securely around him. I looked around the miserable freezing space and felt the last remaining chains of familial obligation shatter completely. They had taken my money, my career, my fiancé, and my reputation. They had left me to freeze in the dark while they basked in the warmth of my stolen life. But they made one fatal miscalculation. They forgot that the scapegoat is always the one who knows how the entire system operates. They forgot that I was the one who managed the numbers, and numbers never lie. To understand how they could be so ruthlessly cruel, you have to understand the world Vivian Washington desperately clawed her way into. Atlanta is not just a city. It is a highly calibrated social chessboard, especially within the circles of the Black elite. It is a world of legacy fraternities, invitation-only galas, and generational wealth optics. Vivian built her entire identity around proving she belonged at the absolute top of that pyramid. She was obsessed with the aesthetic of Black excellence, but her version of it was entirely performative. She wanted the magazine cover without doing the actual work. I was a constant frustration to her carefully curated image. I spent my days under the harsh fluorescent lights of a corporate accounting firm working 60-hour weeks to build a legitimate career. I did not care about the country club luncheons or the exclusive networking mixers. I cared about financial security and genuine independence. My quiet, exhausting life did not give Vivian anything to brag about to her friends over expensive brunches. I was too practical, too grounded, and frankly, too dark-skinned for Vivian to parade around as her trophy. Then Chloe brought Preston Sterling into our lives, and Vivian finally got the ultimate prize she had been chasing. Preston was 34 years old, a white man who wore expensive fleece vests and called himself a tech entrepreneur. In Vivian's deeply color-struck and status-obsessed mind, Preston was not just a son-in-law. He was a shiny corporate hood ornament. He brought a perceived proximity to white generational wealth that Vivian believed elevated the Washington family name to an untouchable level. She practically rolled out a red carpet for him, treating him like a Silicon Valley visionary who was gracing our family with his presence. The reality was drastically different. Preston was a walking collection of buzzwords and unearned confidence. He ran a tech startup that had no actual product, no revenue, and no clear business model. But he had a knack for sounding important while contributing absolutely nothing to society. From the moment Preston entered the family, he made it his mission to put me in my place. His microaggressions were relentless and insidious, always delivered with a smug, patronizing smile. During our tense Sunday family dinners, he would swirl his imported wine look at me across the table and offer unsolicited career advice. He loved to call me articulate. He would pat me on the back for my little corporate hustle and tell me that if I just read a few more leadership books, I might actually break out of my middle management mindset. Here I was, a certified senior auditor managing multi-million-dollar corporate accounts, and this man whose business was legally classified as a failing entity had the audacity to lecture me on financial literacy. He treated me not as an equal, but as the family helped someone who was just there to process the taxes and stay out of the way of his visionary genius. Vivian ate it up. She enabled his condescension because challenging Preston meant shattering the illusion she had sacrificed everything to build. She demanded I treat him with the utmost reverence, warning me that my aggressive corporate attitude was intimidating and unladylike. She ordered me to smile and nod when Preston interrupted me to explain basic economic principles I had mastered a decade ago. I was forced to swallow my pride week after week, to keep the peace in a family that offered me none in return. But as an auditor, I am trained to look past the confident smiles and the designer suits. I see the cracks in the foundation. I see the numbers. And the numbers surrounding Chloe and Preston were a glaring red flag. They lived in a massive, pristine mansion in the heart of Buckhead. Chloe drove a brand new luxury SUV and spent her afternoons shopping for imported silk furniture and booking extravagant vacations. Preston was constantly flying first class to what he called critical investor retreats in Aspen and Miami. They projected an image of limitless, untethered wealth. The Atlanta social scene heralded them as the ultimate power couple, bridging the gap between tech innovation and high society glamour. It was a complete and total fabrication. Preston was bleeding money, and Chloe refused to work a single day in her life. The Buckhead mansion, the luxury cars, the investor retreats, they were all being funded by Vivian. My mother was quietly and systematically draining her own assets to keep her golden child and her trophy son-in-law afloat. I noticed it first when I saw the mail Vivian carelessly left on the kitchen counter during one of my obligatory visits. Overdue notices from property tax authorities. Statements showing massive withdrawals from her retirement accounts. Vivian had even leveraged the family-owned condo, taking out a second mortgage just to inject cash into Preston's dying LLC so he could keep up appearances. My mother was cannibalizing her own financial future to pay for their fake lifestyle. When I tried to confront her about it, when I sat her down and gently tried to explain that Preston was running a classic shell game and dragging her into bankruptcy, she exploded. She accused me of being painfully jealous of my sister's perfect marriage. She screamed that my lack of vision and my bitter single-woman mindset made me incapable of understanding how high-level startup investments worked. She told me to stay out of her finances and focus on finding a husband before my biological clock ran out. So I backed off. I kept my head down and focused entirely on my own life, my own savings, and my own peace of mind. I thought that if I just removed myself from their financial disaster, they would eventually crash and burn on their own without taking me down with them. I assumed my quiet boundary would keep me safe. I assumed that since I asked for nothing, they would leave me with the little I had managed to build for myself. I was completely wrong. The problem with a lifestyle built on a lie is that it requires a constant, massive influx of cash to sustain it. Vivian's retirement accounts were running dry. The equity on her properties was maxed out. Preston's fake startup was days away from defaulting on loans that Vivian had personally guaranteed. The walls were closing in on them, and their desperation was mutating into something incredibly dangerous. They were drowning in the deep end of Atlanta high society, and they desperately needed a life raft. They needed a new source of capital, something untapped, something substantial enough to pay off Preston's mounting debts and keep Chloe in her designer bags. And they found it the moment I walked into Vivian's pristine living room 8 months ago, glowing with happiness to announce that my fiancé Malik and I were expecting a baby. I thought I was sharing a moment of pure joy. I did not realize I was handing starving predators their next meal. It was a warm evening 8 months ago, during one of Josephine's mandatory Sunday dinners at her estate. Malik and I had arrived with a secret that felt like a tiny sun glowing in my chest. Malik was my sanctuary. He was a brilliant logistics director who approached life with the same steady calm that I did. We had been engaged for 6 months, and our relationship was a quiet refuge away from the chaotic demands of my family. He loved me fiercely, and he was the first man who ever made me feel like I was the prize, not the workhorse. When we discovered I was pregnant, we spent 3 days just wrapped in each other, absorbing the profound joy of the family we were about to build. We decided to share the news at the end of dinner. The dining room was buzzing with the usual performative chatter. Vivian was holding court at the head of the table, boasting about a charity gala she was supposedly chairing. Chloe was obsessively checking her reflection in her phone screen, while Preston aggressively cornered one of Josephine's wealthy friends, attempting to pitch another round of funding for his non-existent tech platform. It was the standard Washington family theater. When the dessert plates were cleared, Malik stood up and gently pulled me up beside him. He wrapped his arm around my waist, his hand resting protectively on my stomach. The room quieted down. With a smile that radiated pure pride, Malik announced that we were expecting a baby. The reaction was split into two completely different universes. Josephine, who famously kept her emotions locked behind a wall of steel, actually dropped her silver fork onto her porcelain plate with a sharp clatter. Her piercing eyes widened, and for the first time in my adult life, I saw genuine unbridled joy break across my grandmother's face. She stood up, walked around the massive mahogany table, and pulled me into a fierce embrace. A great grandson. She repeated the words as if they were a sacred prayer, the continuation of our legacy. She shook Malik's hand with deep respect and immediately ordered the kitchen staff to bring out her most expensive bottle of sparkling cider for a toast. But while Josephine was celebrating, I made the mistake of looking across the table at my mother and my sister. The air in their universe had completely evaporated. Vivian's face was frozen in a grotesque mask of shock. The blood had drained entirely from her cheeks, leaving her looking pale and terrified. Chloe gripped the stem of her crystal wine glass so tightly, I thought the glass would shatter in her hand. Her eyes darted from my stomach to Vivian and then to Preston. Preston had stopped his pitching mid-sentence. His smug smile had melted into a hard, calculating scowl. They were not looking at a new family member. They were looking at an immediate existential threat. The panic in their eyes was so palpable it felt like a physical presence in the room. I did not fully understand it at the time. I thought they were just annoyed that my news had upstaged Chloe's new designer outfit or Vivian's charity bragging. I was naive enough to think their jealousy was just the standard petty rivalry I had endured my whole life. I did not realize that they were silently doing the math on their own impending bankruptcy. Then Josephine made the declaration that sealed my fate. Raising her glass of cider, my grandmother commanded the attention of the room. She looked at me and Malik with absolute pride. "A Washington child is a blessing," she announced, her voice echoing off the dining room walls. "And the Washington legacy protects its own. Tomorrow morning, I am calling my wealth management team. I am establishing a trust fund for my first great-grandson. I will personally ensure that this child never wants for anything. His education, his health, and his future will be secured before he even takes his first breath." The silence that followed was deafening. I felt a wave of immense gratitude toward my grandmother, but the atmosphere on the other side of the table turned toxic. Vivian and Chloe exchanged a look of pure, unadulterated terror. It was a silent, frantic conversation communicated entirely through widened eyes and tight jaws. They were desperate for capital. Vivian had drained her accounts and Preston was weeks away from defaulting on massive loans. They had undoubtedly planned to ask Josephine for a massive bailout to save their fraudulent lifestyle. But in one single breath, Josephine had just taken the millions they desperately needed and mentally locked the funds away for my unborn baby. The life raft they were about to beg for had just been handed to the scapegoat of the family. Vivian recovered first, forcing a wide plastic smile onto her face. She walked over and hugged me, but there was no warmth in her arms. Her embrace felt like a snake coiling around its prey. "Oh, Gabrielle," she cooed, her voice tight and high-pitched. "A baby. How overwhelming. Are you sure you are ready for this kind of burden with your demanding job?" Chloe chimed in, her voice dripping with venom masquerading as concern. "Seriously, Gabby, kids are so expensive. And Malik, you guys are barely set up. It is just such a massive financial drain." Malik stepped in immediately, his voice calm but firm, shutting down their passive-aggressive attacks. "We are perfectly secure, Chloe. Gabby and I have our careers and our savings. We do not view our child as a burden or a drain. We are completely ready." Preston scoffed, swirling his wine. "Right. Just wait until the hospital bills hit, man. It is a completely different ballgame." Josephine shut them all down with a sharp rap of her cane against the floor. "There will be no talk of financial burdens," she declared sharply. "I just said his future is secured. My great-grandson will have the best of everything. End of discussion." The dinner concluded shortly after that. As Malik and I walked out to our car, I felt entirely wrapped in a bubble of happiness. I was so focused on Malik's excited chatter about painting a nursery and picking out cribs that I completely ignored the dark storm brewing behind the heavy oak doors of the estate. I did not know that as soon as our car pulled out of the driveway, Vivian, Chloe, and Preston retreated to the drawing room in an absolute panic. I did not know that they were realizing their time had run out, and that my child's trust fund was the only pile of liquid cash large enough to save them from financial ruin. They knew Josephine would never give the money directly to them if she knew they were broke. Josephine despised financial incompetence, but they also knew Josephine was incredibly generous when it came to helping family members who were facing severe, unpreventable crises. They realized that if they could not get the money for themselves, they would have to intercept the money meant for my baby. And to do that, they needed to remove me from the equation entirely. They needed to destroy my credibility so thoroughly that Josephine would never hand me the reins to that trust fund. They needed to isolate me, break my support system, and leave me so desperate that they could step in and control the narrative. The unspoken threat had materialized into a concrete, vicious plan. As I drove home that night, dreaming of my future, my mother and my sister began drafting the blueprints for my complete annihilation. The blueprints for my destruction were drawn up with a cold-blooded precision that still chills me to this day. Preston was an absolute failure as an entrepreneur, but he knew just enough about domain spoofing and digital manipulation to be incredibly dangerous. Sitting in his home office funded entirely by my mother, he registered a web domain that was exactly one letter off from my accounting firm official web address. Using that fake domain, he drafted dozens of highly convincing internal emails between me and a fabricated offshore account manager. Chloe handled the financial alterations. Because I had spent years managing her chaotic taxes, she still had access to some of my old bank statements and digital tax profiles. She took those PDF files and meticulously altered the numbers. She added massive incoming wire transfers labeled as corporate expense bypasses. She fabricated outgoing payments to high-end casinos, luxury car rentals, and boutique hotels. They painted a picture of a woman who was not a diligent senior auditor, but a reckless, desperate embezzler funding a secret double life. But they knew that financial fraud alone might not be enough to make Malik walk away completely. Malik was a loyal man. If he thought I was just in financial trouble, he might have tried to stay and help me fight it. To make the deception truly unbreakable, they needed to destroy his heart. They needed a motive for the supposed embezzlement that would shatter his pride and sever his attachment to my unborn child. They created a phantom lover. They crafted a narrative that I was involved with a wealthy married executive who demanded I keep up with his extravagant lifestyle. Preston generated fake hotel receipts, matching the exact dates I had been working late nights at the office during the grueling tax season. He even fabricated text message transcripts using burner phone apps, making it look like I was mocking Malik behind his back, calling him boring and poor compared to my wealthy secret benefactor. Timing was everything for their trap to work. They waited until mid-October when my firm sent me on a mandatory 3-day out-of-state audit for a major corporate client. I was placed in a secure, windowless facility in Texas with absolute zero cell phone reception during business hours. I could not be reached to defend myself. That was when Vivian made her move. My mother did not just send Malik a text or a casual email. She orchestrated a masterpiece of psychological manipulation. She invited him over to her Buckhead mansion under the guise of wanting to look at fabric swatches for the baby nursery. When Malik arrived carrying a box of pastries he bought just for her, Vivian was sitting at the head of her massive mahogany dining table. She was weeping softly into a silk handkerchief. The fabricated dossier was laid out across the polished wood like a crime scene. She played the role of the devastated, terrified mother to absolute perfection. She told Malik that she had accidentally intercepted a package meant for me and discovered a horrifying truth. She pushed the forged bank statements across the table. She showed him the fake emails detailing the supposed corporate theft. Malik was a logistics director. He was a man whose entire career was built on analyzing data and trusting documents. When presented with what looked like ironclad financial records and institutional emails, his logical brain short-circuited his emotional trust. And then Vivian delivered the fatal blow. With tears streaming down her face, she looked Malik in the eye and told him I was under active investigation by the federal government. She claimed my accounting firm was quietly building a case against me, and that I was facing up to 20 years in federal prison for wire fraud and embezzlement. When Malik, sitting there in utter shock, tried to defend my character, Vivian pulled out the fake hotel receipts and the burner phone transcripts. She cried harder, sobbing as she told him that I had been living a disgusting double life. She pointed to the dates of the hotel bookings aligning perfectly with the nights I had called him from the office exhausted, saying I was drowning in paperwork. The dates matched flawlessly because Chloe had specifically pulled them from my shared calendar. Vivian reached across the table and grabbed Malik by the hand, squeezing them tightly. "You are a good man, Malik," she whispered, her voice shaking with manufactured grief. "You are honorable and kind. I love my daughter, but she is sick. She is greedy, and she is reckless. I cannot in good conscience let you tie your life and your pristine reputation to a woman who is about to be indicted." Malik was paralyzed, trying to process the sudden destruction of his entire world. But Vivian was not done. She leaned in closer and planted the darkest, most venomous seed of all. She looked down at the fake hotel receipts, then back up at him. "Given this secret life Malik given this other man," she whispered, "I cannot let you ruin your future believing the child she is carrying is yours. We think she is trying to trap you to pay for her legal defense." Malik broke. The man who had held me so tenderly just days before completely shattered under the weight of my mother lies. He pulled out his phone and tried to call me desperately, needing to hear my voice to hear me deny it. But I was in the secure facility in Texas. My phone went straight to voicemail. To Malik, that deafening silence confirmed every single lie Vivian had just fed him. He left my mother house in a state of absolute shock. By the time I finally emerged from the audit facility and turned my phone back on, the damage was already done. The demolition of my life had been executed flawlessly. When my flight landed at Hartsfield-Jackson Airport, I turned my phone off airplane mode, expecting to see Malik's usual text asking what I wanted for dinner. Instead, my screen lit up with a barrage of notifications that made my blood run cold. There was no warm greeting. There was only a single message from Malik telling me his bags were packed and he was leaving the key on the kitchen counter. I drove home in a frantic blur. When I burst through the front door of our shared apartment, the silence was suffocating. Malik was standing in the living room holding his duffel bag. His eyes, which had always looked at me with such deep protective warmth, were entirely dead. I ran to him, begging him to tell me what was wrong. He did not yell. He did not raise his voice. He simply reached into his jacket pocket and handed me a thick manila folder. It was the dossier, the fake bank statements, the fabricated emails, the burner phone transcripts. I frantically tried to explain that it was a lie, that none of it made sense. I told him to look at the routing numbers to check the IP addresses. But Malik was a man of logic, and my own mother had presented him with what looked like an airtight federal indictment. He looked at my stomach, and the pain in his face was so profound, it physically broke my heart. "Vivian told me everything, Gabrielle," he said, his voice cracking. "The embezzlement, the other man. I cannot be part of this. I cannot build a life with someone who would trap me like this." Before I could even process the magnitude of the betrayal, he walked out the door. The man I loved, the father of my unborn child, was gone. My mother had severed my greatest source of love and stability with a single conversation. But Vivian and Chloe were not finished. The destruction of my personal life was only phase 1. Phase 2 began the very next morning at exactly 9 o'clock. I arrived at my accounting firm running on zero sleep and sheer panic, desperate to bury myself in work. Before I could even log into my computer, I was summoned to the managing partner office. When I walked in, the head of human resources was sitting there with a grim expression. Printed across the mahogany desk were the exact same forged emails and bank statements Vivian had shown Malik. An anonymous whistleblower had overnighted the package to the firm executive board. The partners were terrified. In the world of high-level corporate auditing, reputation is absolute. The mere whisper of a federal investigation or financial misconduct is enough to destroy a firm overnight. They did not care about due process. They did not care about my years of flawless performance reviews. They saw a liability and they moved to neutralize it immediately. The managing partner slid a single sheet of paper across the desk. It was a letter of immediate resignation. He told me I had two choices. I could sign the letter, surrender my corporate credentials, and walk away quietly. Or I could refuse, and they would terminate me for cause and hand the anonymous dossier directly to the authorities for a formal fraud investigation. Pregnant, terrified, and completely outmatched by the sophisticated forgery Preston had created, I signed the paper. In less than 10 minutes, a career I had spent 10 grueling years building was incinerated. I was escorted out of the building by security holding a small cardboard box of my belongings. I had no fiancé, I had no income, but I still had a roof over my head. I lived in a 2-bedroom condo in Midtown Atlanta. It was legally owned by the Washington Family Trust, but Vivian had allowed me to live there as long as I paid the property taxes and maintenance fees. It was my sanctuary. When I pulled into the parking garage that afternoon carrying my cardboard box from the office, I found Vivian and Preston standing in the lobby of my building. Preston was holding a clipboard and looking incredibly smug. Vivian wore a designer trench coat and an expression of manufactured pity. I did not even have the energy to scream. I just stared at the woman who gave birth to me, the woman who had just orchestrated my complete ruin. Vivian stepped forward, sighing heavily. Malik called me, she lied smoothly. He told me what you did, Gabrielle. The embezzlement, the cheating. I am so profoundly disappointed in you. I cannot believe I raised a daughter who would bring this kind of shame to the Washington name. I told her I knew it was her. I told her I knew she and Chloe had fabricated the entire thing. Vivian did not even flinch. She just shook her head, looking at Preston as if I were a delusional patient. You are clearly unwell, Vivian said, her voice dripping with condescension. And because you are a liability, I cannot have you residing in a family property. We are liquidating assets to protect the family from whatever federal charges you are about to face. Preston needs this unit immediately to set up server space for his new tech platform. You have 48 hours to vacate the premises. Preston stepped up, tapping his pen against the clipboard. Sorry, Gabby, he said with a completely hollow smile. Business is business. I have investors coming to town and we need a physical hub. Do not worry, though. I am sure you can find a nice, quiet place to lay low while the feds sort out your little accounting problem. They handed me a formal eviction notice typed up by Vivian Lawyer. I had 48 hours to pack my entire life into a rental truck. The descent into absolute poverty happened with terrifying speed. Without a job reference, without Malik income, and with a ruined reputation, I could not secure a lease at any decent apartment complex. I burned through my modest savings in 2 months, just trying to stay afloat in a cheap, unheated studio apartment on the outskirts of the city. I applied for dozens of jobs, but the corporate finance world in Atlanta is incredibly small. The rumors of my quiet resignation had spread. Nobody would hire me. I was completely isolated. The scapegoat had been successfully exiled to the wilderness. As my pregnancy progressed, my bank account dwindled to zero. I had no health insurance. I sold my jewelry. I sold my designer work clothes. And eventually, as I stood in the freezing studio with a newborn baby suffering from the cold, I had to sell my professional laptop for $300 just to pay the hospital copay. I was living on ramen noodles and tap water. I was entirely alone, stripped of my identity, my career, and my future. Vivian and Chloe had won. They had successfully diverted the threat. They believed I would quietly starve in the shadows, too ashamed and broken to ever show my face in their world again. They thought they had buried me so deep under their lies that I would never find my way back to the surface. But lying in that freezing room holding Elijah, I realized something vital. They had taken my job, but they had not taken my mind. I was still a senior financial auditor. I knew how to follow a paper trail better than anyone in the state of Georgia. I just needed the authority to look. And that was what finally drove me out of the shadows and up the winding driveway of Josephine Estate. That was what brought me to the marble foyer, shivering in a thrift store coat, ready to drop the truth bomb that would shatter their reality. The warmth of Josephine's private executive boardroom was a stark contrast to the freezing studio apartment I had just been recalling. Elijah was finally asleep, resting safely in a vintage mahogany crib that my grandmother's staff had hurriedly brought down from the estate attic. He was warm, his stomach was full of premium formula, and for the first time in his short life, he was completely safe. I was wearing a clean, tailored cashmere sweater and dark trousers provided by the head housekeeper. The physical starvation and the bone-deep cold were gone. In their place, a burning, relentless hunger for justice had taken root. I walked into the massive wood-paneled boardroom and took a deep breath. The transition from a hunted victim to an apex predator had officially begun. Josephine was already sitting at the head of the sprawling conference table. Flanking her were three older men in immaculate, expensive suits. These were the architects of her financial empire, her lead corporate attorney, and two senior wealth managers. They looked up when I entered, their expressions a mixture of professional detachment and lingering pity. They still saw the desperate, shivering woman who had collapsed in the foyer just hours ago. They did not know me. They did not know what I was capable of when properly armed. I pulled out a heavy leather chair and sat down directly to my grandmother's right. Josephine did not offer any gentle grandmotherly coddling. She knew that was not what I needed. Instead, she slid a heavy encrypted laptop and a thick stack of security fobs across the polished wood table toward me. "Gentlemen," Josephine said, her voice echoing with chilling authority, "my daughter and my granddaughter have stolen from me. More importantly, they tried to bury my granddaughter and starve my great-grandson to cover their tracks. I want every single account, every trust ledger, and every wire transfer authorized in the last 8 months completely opened." The lead attorney shifted uncomfortably in his seat, adjusting his tie. "Ms. Washington," he began cautiously, "with all due respect, opening the master ledgers without a court order or an internal review board is highly irregular. We should hire an independent forensic firm to handle this. It will take a few weeks to organize the subpoenas and navigate the privacy protocols." Josephine slammed the tip of her cane onto the hardwood floor with a crack like a gunshot. The lawyer jumped. "We are not hiring an outside firm." Josephine snapped, her eyes flashing with pure rage. "And we are not waiting a few weeks. You are looking at a certified senior corporate auditor who spent the last 10 years dissecting Fortune 500 companies. You will give her the master passwords. You will bypass the security protocols. And you will do it right now, or you can all pack up your desks and find new clients by sunset." The men swallowed hard, exchanging nervous glances before nodding quickly. One by one, they slid their master security keys across the table. I pulled the encrypted laptop toward me and opened the screen. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. It had been nearly a year since I touched high-level financial software. When my firm forced my resignation, I thought I would never look at a master ledger again. But as the crisp blue interface of the banking portal illuminated my face, it felt like breathing clean oxygen after drowning in muddy water. Vivian, Chloe, and Preston took my fiancé, my home, and my reputation. But they were arrogant and foolish. They forgot they left me with the one weapon that could absolutely destroy them. They forgot that I was a master of forensic accounting. I do not see money as mere currency. I see money as a digital fingerprint. I looked up at the wealth managers. "I need the exact routing numbers for the $250,000 trust fund you established 8 months ago." I demanded, my voice carrying the sharp, undeniable authority of a senior auditor. "I also need Vivian's proxy access logs and the IP addresses for every digital signature authorized under the Washington Family Trust." The men scrambled to comply, sliding files and writing down access codes. I cracked my knuckles, the sharp sound echoing in the quiet boardroom. For my entire life, I was the family mule. I was the quiet, obedient workhorse who fixed their messes and absorbed their insults. Now I was going to dissect them. I typed in the master passwords and watched the security firewalls drop. The hunt had begun. Numbers do not care about Atlanta high society. They do not care about exclusive country club memberships, designer labels, or the fragile egos of fake tech entrepreneurs. Numbers are cold, ruthless, and relentless. They leave a trail of breadcrumbs that cannot be gaslit, manipulated, or cried away. I started by pulling the global transaction history for the $250,000. Josephine had authorized the transfer precisely 1 week after Malik and I announced my pregnancy at that fateful Sunday dinner. The money was originally intended to be parked in a secure, high-yield custodial account in Elijah's name, but the funds never reached that destination. Hour by hour, the sun set outside the massive boardroom windows, casting long shadows across the mahogany table. The lawyers eventually packed up and left, realizing very quickly that I did not need their assistance. Josephine stayed. She sat silently in the corner of the room, drinking black tea, simply watching me work. The rapid clicking of my keyboard was the only sound in the room. I was pulling bank records, cross-referencing IP addresses, and extracting metadata from digital signatures. This was my domain. I was not crying over Malik anymore. I was not begging Vivian for basic human decency. I was systematically dismantling the very foundation of their fake empire. Every spreadsheet I opened, every transaction history I downloaded, revealed another layer of their absolute financial depravity. They thought I was just a corporate drone. They thought auditing was just boring math for people who lacked vision. They did not understand that a senior forensic auditor is the equivalent of a financial homicide detective, and I was investigating my own murder. I isolated the initial diversion of funds. I found the exact timestamp where the routing numbers were altered. I smiled, feeling the cold, hard satisfaction of a trap snapping shut. I had picked up the scent, and I was not going to stop until I tracked the blood all the way back to their front door. I pulled the initial authorization form from the master archive. There it was in stark black and white, a digitally signed addendum attached to the $250,000 wire transfer. The signature belonged to Vivian. My mother had submitted a formal request to route the baby's trust through an intermediary holding account. I read the attached memorandum and scoffed at the sheer audacity of her lies. Vivian had cited my demanding career and supposedly complex tax bracket as a senior auditor to justify the diversion. She convinced Josephine that a direct transfer would trigger massive tax penalties for me. Instead, Vivian suggested parking the funds in a family-managed shell trust designed specifically for tax shielding and asset management. Josephine, focusing purely on wealth preservation, signed off on the diversion without a second thought, trusting her daughter to handle the administrative red tape. But that shell account was not a protective shield. It was a slaughterhouse. I ran a velocity check on the outbound transactions. The money did not sit and accumulate interest. It started moving exactly 72 hours after Vivian sat at her mahogany dining table and convinced Malik I was a federal criminal. The timing was sickeningly perfect. They destroyed my life on a Tuesday and started draining my son's future on a Friday. They thought they were clever. They did not move the $250,000 in one massive wire transfer. Anyone who watches television knows a transaction of that size sets off automatic flags with the Internal Revenue Service and banking compliance boards. Instead, they used a technique called structuring. They broke the stolen funds down into smaller randomized increments. $12,000 on the first of the month, $8,500 2 days later, $9,000 on a Monday. It was a classic layering tactic designed to mimic standard operational business expenses and slip right past automated fraud detection algorithms. To an untrained eye, it just looked like a busy account paying vendors. To a forensic auditor, it looked like a neon sign flashing absolute guilt. I highlighted the destination routing numbers and fed them into the state and federal business registries. The search bar pulsed for a fraction of a second before spitting out the corporate entity receiving the stolen funds. Sterling Innovation Partners, LLC. I let out a dry, humorless laugh that echoed in the empty boardroom. Preston. The smug, arrogant fraud who lectured me on pulling myself up by my bootstraps was actively surviving on a financial blood transfusion funded by my newborn child. I bypassed the external registry and pulled up the operational ledger for Preston's LLC, using Josephine's master override access. The company had zero incoming revenue, no legitimate clients, no software sales, no intellectual property patents. The only capital keeping the entity legally afloat was the steady stream of stolen cash from the Shell Trust. I dug deeper, wanting to see exactly what Preston considered essential tech startup expenses. The money did not go towards software developers, patent lawyers, or the server space he claimed he needed when he evicted me from my home. The funds were being instantly funneled back out to cover Vivian's catastrophic financial mistakes and fund Chloe's bottomless vanity. I watched the digital paper trail map out their pathetic priorities in real time. $30,000 was wired directly to a predatory commercial lender to stop an impending default on a loan Vivian had personally guaranteed for Preston the year prior. $15,000 went to a luxury automotive leasing company to cover the back payments on Chloe's heavily financed SUV. Another $40,000 was dispersed to high-end event planners, catering companies, and Buckhead Country Club membership dues. They were literally drinking champagne bought with the money meant for Elijah's diapers and crib. They evicted a pregnant woman into the freezing winter so they could keep pretending they were royalty at charity galas. They did not steal for survival. They stole for aesthetics. They stole because they believed their illusion of black excellence was inherently more valuable than my actual life. My fingers flew across the keyboard, downloading every single statement. The quiet of the boardroom was broken only by the rapid, rhythmic clicking of the keys. Josephine sat silently in the corner, watching me work her tea, completely forgotten. She did not interrupt. She recognized a professional dismantling a target, and she let me execute my craft. I generated certified files and locked them behind 2 layers of encrypted passwords. I mapped out the flow of money in a glaring, undeniable flowchart, linking Vivian's authorization signature directly to Preston's fraudulent corporate accounts. The financial web was completely untangled. The embezzlement was proven beyond a shadow of a legal doubt. I had everything I needed to send all 3 of them to a federal penitentiary. But as I finalized the structuring report, a strange discrepancy caught my eye in the secondary ledger. There was another set of accounts tethered to Preston's LLC, accounts that did not belong to Josephine's master estate. I frowned, adjusting my posture as I zeroed in on a completely different routing sequence. The initial $250,000 accounted for their basic survival and debt management, but the math regarding Chloe's recent exorbitant spending sprees still did not add up perfectly. The designer wardrobes, the spa retreats, the sudden influx of cash that kept their lifestyle afloat beyond the initial theft required more capital than what was missing from the trust. There was more money flowing into the Buckhead mansion, money from a source I had not yet identified. A cold sense of dread settled in the pit of my stomach. The structuring was sloppy here, lacking the careful layering Vivian had used with the trust. This was arrogant, reckless spending. I cracked my knuckles once again and drove my cursor straight into the secondary data stream, running a global identity check on the origin of the unknown funds. I was about to uncover something that crossed the line from greedy manipulation to downright sociopathic criminality. I initiated a deep scrub on the secondary data stream, feeding into Preston and his failing company. I bypassed the corporate shell layers and pulled the raw credit reports linked to the incoming cash flow. I expected to find predatory high-interest payday loans, or maybe another one of Vivian and her secretly mortgaged properties. I did not expect to see my own name staring back at me from the glowing screen. 5 platinum credit cards, 3 high-limit personal loans, all opened within the last 8 months, all attached directly to my Social Security number. The total outstanding balance sat at a sickening $80,000. The air in my lungs turned to ice. I am a senior financial auditor. I lock my credit down with ironclad security measures. But 8 months ago, I was completely blindsided. Malik walked out. My firm forced my resignation. I was evicted and forced to change addresses 3 times in 2 months just to keep a roof over my head. My life was in absolute chaos and my mail was scattered across the city. Vivian, playing the concerned mother during those early weeks, had offered to forward my old mail from the family condo to my new post office box. She never forwarded the credit alerts. She intercepted them. Chloe already had all my personal tax documents from the years I generously did her returns for free. They had my full legal name, my date of birth, my social security number, and my previous residential addresses. It was the perfect storm for identity theft, and my own mother and sister had orchestrated it flawlessly. I pulled the IP addresses from the digital credit card applications to confirm what I already knew in my gut. They did not even try to cover their digital footprints. Every single fraudulent application was submitted from the IP address registered to Preston and Chloe at their Buckhead mansion. I opened the itemized billing statements for the platinum cards. The sheer audacity of their purchases made my vision blur with a rage so pure it felt like physical heat. This was not money used to keep the lights on or pay the mortgage. This was pure, unadulterated vanity. I tracked a $12,000 charge at a Cartier boutique in the luxury shopping district. I knew exactly what that was. I had seen Chloe flaunting a new designer handbag and a diamond watch on her social media weeks ago, captioning the photo with a quote about how hard work always pays off. My hard work, my stolen credit, my ruined future. I scrolled further down the ledger. $15,000 dropped on luxury weekend spa retreats at Sea Island. Thousands of dollars spent at high-end steakhouses and exclusive rooftop bars across Atlanta. Then I isolated Preston and his expenditures. He had charged $25,000 to book luxury villas in Miami and Aspen. He categorized the charges as executive investor retreats for his fake tech startup. He was flying first class, popping expensive champagne, and pitching his useless company to wealthy marks, all while using a credit card bearing my stolen identity. While they were swiping my name to buy imported wine and luxury vacations, I had been shivering in an unheated studio apartment counting pennies just to buy prenatal vitamins. They were padding their glamorous Atlanta socialite lifestyle with the literal food out of my unborn baby mouth. It is one thing to steal money from a wealthy matriarch who has millions to spare. It is an entirely different level of evil to steal the identity of your pregnant, unemployed sister and bury her in $80,000 of high-interest debt she can never repay. They did not just want me out of the picture so they could secure Josephine and her wealth. They wanted me permanently shackled to poverty. They knew exactly what they were doing. If I ever tried to rebuild my life, if I ever applied for another corporate finance job that required a standard credit check or tried to rent a safe apartment for my son, this $80,000 anchor would drag me straight to the bottom of the ocean. They had financially murdered me and were wearing my skin to the country club. I leaned back in the heavy leather chair. The quiet hum of the laptop cooling fan was the only sound in the vast boardroom. I looked over at Josephine. She was still sitting in the corner watching me with sharp, calculating eyes. I turned the laptop screen toward her. I did not shed a single tear. I pointed to the $80,000 in fraudulent debt and the itemized receipts of Chloe and Preston living like royalty on my stolen credit. I explained exactly how Vivian had intercepted my mail and how my sister had hijacked my financial identity to fund her vanity. Josephine stared at the screen. Her jaw tightened so fiercely I thought her teeth might crack under the pressure. The matriarch of the Washington family was looking at the undeniable proof that she had raised a daughter and a granddaughter completely devoid of a moral compass. She finally spoke, her voice a lethal, quiet whisper that commanded absolute obedience. "What do you want to do with them, Gabrielle?" she asked. I looked at the master files I had compiled over the last few hours. I had the wire fraud and the embezzlement from the baby trust fund. I had the federal identity theft and the credit fraud. I had everything required to lock all three of them away in a federal penitentiary for decades. But handing this over to the police right now was too easy. A quiet arrest behind closed doors would allow Vivian to spin the narrative. She would play the victim. She would tell her high society friends that it was all a misunderstanding. They needed to feel the exact same public humiliation and paralyzing terror they had inflicted on me. They needed to believe they were untouchable right up until the moment the floor completely collapsed beneath their feet. "I want to look them in the eyes one last time," I told my grandmother, closing the laptop with a decisive snap. "I want them to confess their cruelty on my terms." And then we set the trap for the entire city to see. The cold metal of the microphone taped against my ribs felt like a shield. Josephine had brought in a retired federal agent turned private investigator to wire me up. Georgia is a one-party consent state, meaning I had every legal right to record my own conversations, but Josephine wanted the execution to be absolutely flawless. The audio feed was transmitting directly to an encrypted server monitored by the investigator in a van parked 3 blocks away. Every cruel word my family was about to say would be preserved in digital amber. To make the trap work, I had to step back into the role of the defeated, broken scapegoat. I wiped my face completely clean of makeup, letting the dark circles under my eyes show. I put the faded, oversized thrift store coat back on. I hunched my shoulders and practiced the fearful, submissive gaze I had worn for the last 8 months. I had to look like a woman who had finally been crushed by the weight of her own supposed failures. I chose an ultra-exclusive prime steakhouse in the heart of Buckhead for our meeting. It was the exact kind of pretentious, high-society establishment Vivian considered her natural habitat. I used one of Josephine's concierges to secure a private leather booth in the back, but I told my mother I had begged the restaurant manager for a cancellation and used my last remaining dollars to host them. I told her I was ready to apologize. I told her I was desperate. That was the bait they simply could not resist. The opportunity to watch me grovel in a luxury restaurant was catnip to their narcissism. I sat alone in the dim lighting of the booth, staring at my glass of tap water. The restaurant buzzed with the clinking of crystal and the low hum of expensive deals being made. I took a deep breath, centering my heart rate. I was an auditor walking into a hostile boardroom. I just had to let them talk. Then they walked through the grand mahogany doors. The sheer audacity of their appearance nearly made me laugh out loud. They paraded into the restaurant looking like absolute royalty, completely untouched by the financial devastation they had caused. Vivian led the pack wearing a tailored silk trench coat and a condescending smile reserved for the service staff. Chloe followed close behind, her perfectly styled hair cascading over her shoulders. Tucked securely under Chloe's arm was the exact $10,000 Cartier bag she had purchased using my stolen social security number. Bringing up the rear was Preston. He wore his signature faux tech entrepreneur uniform, consisting of a crisp designer button-down and a $500 cashmere vest. He strutted past the hostess stand with the unearned swagger of a man who believed he was the smartest person in any room. He had the absolute nerve to look bored by the entire outing. They slid into the semicircular leather booth opposite me, physically boxing themselves in. They did not offer a hug or a warm greeting. They looked at me as if I were a stain on the upholstery. Vivian immediately signaled a waiter and ordered a $300 bottle of imported red wine without even glancing at a menu. She knew I had claimed to be paying with my last pennies, and she ordered the most expensive vintage specifically to watch me squirm. I kept my head down, playing the role perfectly. "You look terrible, Gabrielle," Vivian said, leaning back against the leather cushions and crossing her arms. "I hope you did not drag us all the way down to Buckhead just to ruin our appetites with a pity party. We are very busy people." I forced my hands to tremble slightly as I reached for my water glass. I took a small sip, projecting absolute desperation. "Mom, I am so sorry to bother you all," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "But I have nowhere else to go. I am facing eviction on Friday. Elijah has a persistent cough and I cannot afford to take him to the pediatrician. My bank accounts are completely overdrawn." Chloe scoffed loudly, rolling her eyes as she adjusted the stolen Cartier bag on the table, making sure the logo caught the dim restaurant lighting. "Honestly, Gabby, this is so manipulative," Chloe sneered. "You made your bed when you decided to be a reckless criminal. Did you really think embezzling from your accounting firm was going to end well? You threw away a perfectly good career and drove Malik away. Being a destitute single mother is a result of your own moral failures. Do not try to put that burden on us." I looked at my sister, marveling at the sociopathic ease with which she delivered those lies. She had forged the documents that destroyed my career. She had helped orchestrate the lie that broke my engagement. Yet she sat there, dripping in diamonds paid for by my stolen identity, lecturing me on morality. Preston chuckled, swirling his ice water. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, and looked at me with pure, unadulterated condescension. You know, Gabby, in the startup world, we call this a hard pivot, Preston said, a smug smile playing on his lips. You failed. You got caught. Now you have to face the market correction. Coming to us for a bailout is just lazy. It shows a fundamental lack of character. I bit the inside of my cheek using the physical pain to keep my face completely submissive. Preston, you know I always worked hard, I pleaded, letting my voice crack perfectly. I just need a small loan, even a few $100s to keep the heat on in my apartment. I know Vivian has the money. I know the family trust is robust. Please, just to keep Elijah warm. The trap was set. The bait was dangling right in front of them. All I needed was for them to open their mouths and take the bite. I needed them to gloat about their wealth and confirm their absolute refusal to help my child while actively spending his money. I sat perfectly still, waiting for the predators to feast. Vivian let out a sharp, theatrical sigh, adjusting her silk collar as the waiter arrived to uncork their expensive vintage. She did not even pause her conversation as the dark red wine splashed into her crystal glass. She waited until the server retreated before leaning across the table, fixing me with a stare devoid of any maternal warmth. The family trust. Vivian repeated the words as if they left a foul taste in her mouth. You have incredible nerve bringing up family assets after the absolute shame you brought to the Washington name. You embarrassed us in front of all of Atlanta. You destroyed your engagement to a good man because you could not control your own reckless impulses. And now you expect me to open my checkbook to clean up the consequences. I forced my eyes to well up with tears biting the inside of my cheek hard enough to taste blood. Mom, I am not asking for a handout to live luxuriously, I begged, my voice cracking with manufactured vulnerability. I am asking for $50. Elijah needs hypoallergenic formula and a winter coat that actually fits him. He is your grandson. Vivian slammed her manicured hand onto the table, making the silverware rattle. Do not dare use that child as a weapon against me, she hissed. Being a destitute single mother is a result of your own moral failures, Gabrielle. It is not my job to subsidize your terrible choices. If I give you money now, I am just enabling a criminal. That is what you are. A corporate embezzler who got caught. The fact that you are freezing in a cheap apartment is exactly the lesson you need to learn. The microphone taped to my ribs captured every single syllable of her vicious declaration. She was actively admitting to withholding resources from a starving infant under the guise of moral superiority. Chloe, sensing an opportunity to pile on, leaned forward and placed her elbows on the table. In doing so, she deliberately pushed her brand-new Cartier handbag directly into the center of the table, right under the dim pendant light. It was a stunning piece of craftsmanship made of pristine black leather, with the signature Panther hardware gleaming in gold. Honestly, Gabby, you have to understand our position, Chloe said, tracing the gold hardware with her freshly manicured fingernail. We are public figures in this city. Preston is building a tech empire, and I have a social brand to maintain. Do you know how expensive it is to operate at our level? We cannot just bleed cash to support a disgraced relative. It ruins our aesthetic. We have to be incredibly careful with our finances to secure our own legacy. I stared at the Cartier bag. My heart beat a slow, heavy rhythm against the wire on my chest. I did not just know what brand that bag was. I knew its exact digital DNA. I knew it cost $10,500. I knew it was purchased at the Cartier boutique at Lenox Square exactly 17 days ago at 2:14 in the afternoon. And I knew it was charged to a platinum credit card, opened fraudulently under my social security number. Chloe was sitting across from me, telling me she could not spare $50 for her nephew baby formula while literally stroking a $10,000 bag bought with my stolen identity. The sociopathy was so profound it bordered on cinematic. I kept my eyes locked on the bag, letting a look of pathetic longing wash over my face. That is a beautiful bag, Chloe, I whispered, projecting awe and sadness. You must be doing so well. It is hard for me to even imagine having that kind of security right now. Chloe beamed, her vanity instantly overriding any shred of caution. Oh, this, she said, picking it up and turning it so I could see the immaculate stitching. It was a little treat to myself. Preston had a massive breakthrough with his investors last month, so we decided to celebrate. You know how it is when the money is just flowing. You have to reward yourself for all the hard work. The audio feed caught it all. She was proudly admitting to a sudden massive influx of cash. Cash that perfectly aligned with the exact timeline of the funds being drained from Elijah's trust account. She was wrapping the noose around her own neck and handing me the rope. I slumped my shoulders, sinking lower into the leather booth. I just thought maybe family would help. Family, I murmured, staring down at my glass of tap water. If the trust fund is doing so well, if everyone is celebrating, I do not understand why there is not even a little bit left for a baby. Vivian scoffed, taking a long, elegant sip of her wine. The Washington Family Trust is not a charity for the disgraced, she stated, her voice echoing with absolute authority. That money is strictly managed and allocated to those who uphold the legacy of this family. I am the gatekeeper of those funds, and I am telling you right now that you will never see a single cent of it. You are entirely cut off. I nodded slowly, letting a tear finally spill over my eyelashes and track down my cheek. I sniffled, wiping it away with the sleeve of my thrift store coat. I understand, I said, my voice trembling. I understand exactly how the money is being managed, Mom. They smiled at each other, sharing a look of absolute triumph. They thought they had finally broken the workhorse. They thought they had permanently established their dominance over the scapegoat. They believed they were sitting at the very top of Atlanta high society, drinking expensive wine and wearing stolen diamonds, while I was destined to crawl back to the gutter. They had no idea that I had just successfully maneuvered them into confessing to grand larceny, wire fraud, and elder abuse on a recorded federal-grade audio track. The trap was fully loaded and the spring was ready to snap. All I needed now was for Preston to deliver the final killing blow. Preston finally decided it was his turn to hold court. Until now, he had been content to sit back and watch Vivian and Chloe do the heavy lifting, letting them eviscerate me while he enjoyed the ambiance. He swirled the dark red wine in his crystal glass, holding it up to the dim restaurant lighting to admire the color. He took a long, appreciative sip of a vintage that cost more than my monthly rent and set the glass down with a satisfied sigh. You really need to look at the bigger picture here, Gabby. He began, his tone dripping with the kind of unearned authority only a mediocre white man funded by his mother-in-law could muster. You are stuck in a victim mentality. In the business world, we do not reward failure. We reward innovation. We reward accountability. You made a bad investment with your life choices, and now you are experiencing a margin call. I kept my hands clasped tightly in my lap, digging my fingernails into my palms. You consider my newborn son a bad investment? I asked, my voice trembling with entirely manufactured grief. Preston leaned forward, resting his forearms on the pristine white tablecloth. Do not twist my words, he said softly, though his eyes were hard and devoid of any empathy. I am saying you lack personal responsibility. Look at me. I built sterling innovation partners from the ground up. I put in the sweat equity. I did not go around begging my extended family for handouts when things got tough. I pulled myself up by my bootstraps. That is what successful people do. The sheer suffocating irony of his words almost made me break character. This man was sitting across from me lecturing me on sweat equity, while his fraudulent LLC was actively siphoning $250,000 from my baby trust fund. He was talking about bootstraps while taking lavish vacations funded by credit cards opened under my stolen Social Security number. He was a parasite disguised as a visionary, and he was eagerly documenting his own parasitic nature directly into my hidden microphone. I just thought since your company is doing so well you could spare something. I whimpered, shrinking back into the leather booth, just a tiny fraction of what you have. Preston's face hardened completely. The patronizing tech bro facade vanished, replaced by a nasty defensive sneer. He hated being pressed on his finances, even by someone he perceived as completely powerless. Let us get one thing absolutely clear, Gabby. He snapped, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. You are not getting a dime from me, from Chloe, or from Vivian. You are unstable. You are erratic. Frankly, your presence here tonight is completely inappropriate. Vivian nodded in agreement, taking another sip of her wine. He is right, Gabrielle. This whole display is exhausting. If you ever contact us for money again, Preston continued, leaning in closer so his face was just inches from mine. I will personally call the Atlanta police. I will file for a restraining order, and I will have you arrested for harassment. We will not let a disgraced, desperate woman drag our reputation through the mud just because she cannot figure out how to feed her own kid. Do not test me on this. I protect my assets, and I protect my family. He leaned back, satisfied with his threat. He picked up his wine glass and took another long, luxurious sip. He looked at me with absolute contempt, confident that he had permanently crushed whatever remaining spirit I possessed. They all stared at me, waiting for the final breakdown. They wanted the tears. They wanted me to beg one last time so they could swat me away and return to their expensive steaks feeling like royalty. Instead, I stopped trembling. I unclasped my hands. I sat up perfectly straight, aligning my spine against the back of the booth. The fearful, submissive slump fell away from my shoulders entirely. I looked at Preston, then at Chloe, and finally at Vivian. I smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was a cold, terrifyingly serene expression. It was the smile of a senior forensic auditor who had just balanced the books and found the exact location of every single missing cent. The sudden shift in my demeanor unsettled the table immediately. The smug satisfaction on Preston's face faltered. Chloe stopped stroking her Cartier bag, and Vivian narrowed her eyes, suddenly wary. "What are you smiling at?" Vivian demanded, her voice sharp with sudden anxiety. I reached into the pocket of my oversized thrift store coat. I pulled out a crumpled $5 bill and placed it gently on the pristine white tablecloth, directly next to Preston's crystal wine glass. "That is for my tap water," I said, my voice completely devoid of the pathetic quiver I had maintained all evening. "I like to pay my own debts. You should all learn to do the same." I slid out of the leather booth, standing tall over them. I did not say another word. I did not need to. I turned my back on my mother, my sister, and the man who was bleeding them dry, and I walked out of the steakhouse with long, confident strides. I pushed through the heavy mahogany doors and stepped out into the crisp Atlanta night air. The valet attendants scrambled to open the doors for the wealthy patrons arriving, but I ignored them, walking straight down the block toward an unremarkable gray van parked near the corner. The side door slid open as I approached. The retired federal agent sitting inside pulled off his headphones and turned to face me. The glowing monitors in the back of the van illuminated his grim, satisfied expression. "We got it," he said, tapping a key on his mixing board. "Every single word. Crystal clear audio. They confirmed the spending. They confirmed the timeline, and they explicitly confirmed their intent to withhold the trust funds. It is a perfect match for your financial tracking." I reached under my sweater and carefully removed the microphone receiver, handing it to the investigator. "Bundle the audio files with the master ledgers and the wire transfer logs." I told him, my breath forming small white clouds in the cold air. "Send the complete encrypted package directly to Josephine legal team tonight." I looked back down the street toward the glowing neon sign of the steakhouse. Vivian, Chloe, and Preston were still inside, laughing and drinking wine bought with my stolen identity. They thought they had just finalized my burial. They did not realize they had just finished digging their own graves. The bait was taken. The trap was permanently sealed. Now it was time to build the stage for their public execution. 2 weeks passed in a blur of legal briefings and absolute silence on my end. I let Vivian and Chloe believe their steakhouse victory was final. I let them marinate in their perceived dominance. Then came the night of the gala. Josephine Washington's 80th birthday was not just a party. It was a summit of Atlanta's absolute elite. The grand ballroom of the Four Seasons Hotel had been transformed into a breathtaking sanctuary of gold and white. 10,000 white orchids cascaded from the ceiling in massive floral chandeliers. A 12-piece jazz orchestra played softly in the corner, setting a rhythm of old money elegance. The guest list was a physical manifestation of Black excellence and generational wealth. There were state senators, federal judges, real estate moguls, and media executives. These were people who commanded industries and shaped the political landscape of the South. Into this arena of immense power walked my mother and my sister. They arrived an hour after the doors opened intentionally, timing their entrance for maximum visibility. The flashbulbs from the hired event photographers illuminated them as they paused at the top of the grand staircase. Vivian wore a custom-beaded silver gown that caught every reflection of light in the room. She glided down the steps, waving gracefully, at old friends playing the role of the devoted, successful matriarch to absolute perfection. Close behind her was Chloe. My sister was draped in a breathtaking midnight blue velvet dress, but it was the jewelry that commanded the room. Chloe wore a massive diamond collar necklace and matching chandelier earrings. I did not have to guess where those diamonds came from. I had personally tracked the $45,000 charge to my stolen Social Security number just 3 days prior. She was literally wearing my hijacked credit score around her neck, posing for high society blogs and flashing a brilliant rehearsed smile. They looked like royalty, completely unbothered by the fact that their glamorous facade was built on the financial corpse of my newborn son. And then there was Preston. While Vivian and Chloe worked the photographers, Preston immediately launched himself into the crowd of billionaires. He viewed my grandmother's birthday not as a celebration of her life, but as an exclusive investor networking event he had successfully infiltrated. He wore a bespoke velvet tuxedo jacket and carried a glass of expensive bourbon, moving aggressively from group to group. I watched from the upper balcony, hidden in the shadows, as he cornered Marcus Hayes, one of Atlanta's most ruthless commercial developers. Preston was gesturing wildly, talking with that unearned, aggressive confidence, tapping his temple and pointing at his phone. He was pitching Sterling Innovation Partners. He was throwing around buzzwords like blockchain disruption and decentralized synergy, trying to squeeze fresh capital out of Josephine's friends. He was using her good name as collateral to fund a company that existed entirely as a vehicle for embezzlement. He truly believed he was the smartest man in the room, a Silicon Valley visionary, gracing traditional Southern money with his genius. It was physically nauseating to watch him attempt to swindle legitimately brilliant business minds, all while surviving on cash stolen from an infant. At the center of it all sat Josephine. Her throne was a high-backed gilded chair placed at the head of the main banquet table, flanked by towering centerpieces. She wore a deep purple silk gown, her posture immaculate, her expression entirely unreadable. She accepted the kisses on the cheek from Vivian. She smiled politely as Chloe leaned in for a carefully posed photograph holding her grandmother's hand to ensure the diamonds made it into the frame. Josephine played her part flawlessly. She nodded, she smiled, she thanked them for their beautiful birthday wishes. Vivian and Chloe were so consumed by their own vanity, they completely missed the lethal coldness in Josephine's eyes. They did not notice that the private security guards standing at the exits were not standard hotel staff, but off-duty police officers, specifically hired by Josephine's legal team. They did not notice that the matriarch they were pretending to adore had already signed the comprehensive federal affidavits that would end their freedom. The ballroom buzzed with the clinking of crystal glasses and the low murmur of powerful people making deals. Vivian drifted from table to table, graciously accepting compliments on her stunning family. I watched her lean in to whisper with the mayor's wife, placing a dramatic hand over her heart. She was proactively controlling the narrative. I could practically read her lips from the balcony. She was repeating the same fabricated tragic story about her eldest daughter's mental breakdown, her unfortunate corporate disgrace, and her sudden tragic isolation. She was wiping away a fake tear, cementing my grave in the minds of every influential person in the city. If anyone asked where Gabrielle was, the answer would elicit profound pity for Vivian and absolute disgust for me. The sheer arrogance of their performance was mesmerizing. They felt completely untouchable. They had stolen $250,000 from an infant, committed massive federal identity theft, and mentally broken the one person who could expose them. They thought the game was over. They thought they had won the championship and were currently taking their victory lap. But they forgot the most important rule of corporate auditing. An auditor never announces her presence until the final report is completely finished. The evidence is absolutely irrefutable, and the authorities are already waiting by the doors. The trap was perfectly laid. The entire elite society of Atlanta was seated comfortably, holding their champagne glasses, completely unaware that they were about to witness a live execution. I took a slow, deep breath, smoothing the fabric of the dress Josephine had custom ordered for me. It was time to step out of the shadows. The heavy velvet curtains at the top of the grand staircase concealed me from the ballroom below. I stood in the quiet shadows listening to the lively jazz band and the low hum of hundreds of conversations mingling with the clinking of crystal. I smoothed my hands down the sides of my dress. Josephine had commissioned the gown specifically for this moment, and it was an absolute masterpiece of architectural couture. It was crafted from heavy, luminous emerald green silk that hugged my curves and flowed into a dramatic sweeping train. The color was entirely intentional. Emerald represented rebirth power and the absolute dominance of wealth. It was a staggering physical contrast to the hollow shell of a woman who had stood shivering in a cheap thrift store coat just weeks prior. I was wearing diamond drop earrings from Josephine Private Vault, and my hair was swept up into an immaculate structural updo that elongated my neck and exposed the sharp lines of my jaw. My makeup was flawless, my skin glowing, and my posture was rigid with absolute unyielding authority. I was no longer the family scapegoat. I was a corporate executioner stepping onto the battlefield. I signaled the event coordinator standing near the curtain. She nodded, tapped her headset, and gave a swift cue to the band director below. The upbeat jazz rhythm subtly shifted, melting into a slower, more dramatic, and commanding tempo. The subtle change in the music acted as a subconscious signal to the crowd. Conversations began to taper off. Heads naturally turned toward the grand staircase to see what was commanding the shift in the atmosphere. I parted the velvet curtains and stepped out onto the landing. The lighting caught the emerald silk, instantly bathing me in a vibrant, radiant glow. I did not rush. I placed my stiletto on the first marble step and began my descent with a slow, deliberate, and lethal cadence. The reaction from the ballroom floor was instantaneous and electric. A collective audible gasp rippled through the sea of Atlanta high society. These were the very same politicians, judges, and industry titans who had just been fed a tragic fabricated story by my mother. Vivian had spent the last hour working the room, shaking her head in mock sorrow, whispering about my supposed mental collapse and my disgraceful isolation. They expected me to be a broken, forgotten tragedy, hidden away in some miserable apartment. Instead, they were looking at a conqueror. The whisper network completely stalled. The entire room seemed to hold its collective breath. I kept my gaze leveled straight ahead, focused entirely on the main banquet table, but my peripheral vision caught the precise, horrifying moment my family realized their nightmare had arrived. Vivian was standing near the center ice sculpture mid-sentence with a prominent federal judge. As the crowd turned, she turned with them. I watched the fake, sympathetic smile physically slide off her face. Her mouth remained open, but the words completely evaporated from her throat. The blood drained from her cheeks with such alarming speed, she looked like a ghost draped in silver beads. The absolute panic radiating from her was palpable. She gripped the edge of a cocktail table so hard her knuckles turned stark white. Chloe physically stumbled backward. She actually lost her footing in her designer heels, bumping into a passing waiter. Her hand flew up in a blind panic to clutch the diamond collar around her neck, as if she suddenly realized the stolen jewels she wore were actively burning her skin. The arrogant, flawless facade she had spent hours preparing shattered into a look of pure, unadulterated terror. Preston completely lost control of his motor functions. He had been aggressively pitching his fraudulent tech startup to a group of commercial investors. When he saw me descending the stairs, radiating wealth and absolute composure, the glass of expensive bourbon slipped right out of his hand. It hit the polished marble dance floor and shattered, sending a loud, sharp crash echoing through the suddenly silent ballroom. Amber liquid and crystal shards scattered across the floor, but no one even looked down. Every eye in the room was fixed on me. Their collective terror was the most intoxicating thing I had ever witnessed. But there was one more person in the massive ballroom whose reaction I needed to see. Malik. He was standing near the far pillar of the room wearing an immaculate black tuxedo. His presence was not an accident. Josephine had orchestrated his attendance with the same ruthless, calculating precision she applied to her corporate acquisitions. Earlier that afternoon, my grandmother's security team had intercepted Malik outside his logistics firm and escorted him to a private suite on the top floor of the Four Seasons. Josephine did not yell at him. She did not berate him for abandoning his pregnant fiancée. She knew that a man whose entire career was built on logic and data needed to be destroyed by logic and data. She sat him down in a quiet room and handed him a thick manila folder. It contained the IP addresses from Preston fraudulent web domain. It contained the unredacted corporate emails proving the embezzlement was a total fabrication. It held the geographic location data proving I was locked in a secure Texas auditing facility without cell service on the exact dates Vivian claimed I was at a luxury hotel with a secret lover. And finally, it contained the raw, high-definition audio file of my mother and sister mocking my financial ruin at the steakhouse, confirming they had orchestrated the entire deception to steal his son trust fund. Malik had to sit in dead silence and watch his own gullibility tear his soul apart. He had to face the brutal, agonizing reality that he had abandoned the woman he loved. He had left his unborn son to freeze in a dilapidated studio apartment because he allowed his male pride to be weaponized by two malicious women. As I reached the bottom of the staircase and began my walk across the ballroom floor, the sea of wealthy guests naturally parted, creating a wide, clear path directly toward the head table where Josephine sat waiting. Malik stepped out from the shadow of the pillar and into the aisle. His face was an absolute portrait of devastation. His eyes were completely bloodshot, brimming with heavy tears he refused to let fall. His broad shoulders shook with ragged, uneven breaths. I saw the desperate, drowning plea in his posture. He was a broken man staring at the woman he had completely failed. He took a hesitant, shaky step toward me. He reached his hand out into the open space between us, his lips silently forming my name. The man I had loved with every fiber of my being, the man I had envisioned building a legacy with, was begging for a single lifeline. He wanted a glance. He wanted a shred of recognition. He wanted me to acknowledge his profound, agonizing regret. But a senior auditor knows that trust is the only currency that actually matters, and his account was completely overdrawn. He had looked at fabricated papers and decided I was a monster without even giving me the basic grace of a conversation. He did not protect me when the wolves came to the door. I did not slow my deliberate pace. I did not soften my expression. I looked directly into his tear-filled eyes, letting him see the absolute unbreakable wall of ice that had replaced the warmth I once held for him. I held his desperate gaze for exactly 2 seconds, and then I kept walking. I brushed right past his outstretched hand, leaving him standing paralyzed and weeping in the center of the ballroom. I did not look back. I continued my march straight toward the head table. Josephine sat in her gilded chair watching me approach. A fierce, deeply proud smile finally broke across my grandmother's face. The trap was locked. The audience was captivated. The execution was about to begin. I reached the head table and stood beside my grandmother. The heavy silence in the grand ballroom was absolute. You could hear the faint rustle of silk and the sharp intake of breath from hundreds of guests waiting for the explosion. Josephine stood up slowly, leaning on her cane. She did not look at my mother or my sister. She looked out at the sea of faces, the politicians, the judges, the moguls who defined Atlanta high society. She stepped up to the crystal podium positioned at the center of the stage and adjusted the microphone. "Thank you all for joining me tonight to celebrate 80 years of life." Josephine began, her voice steady and echoing with undeniable authority. "We have spent the evening talking about the Washington legacy. We have talked about the empire my late husband and I built from a single commercial property into a real estate portfolio that spans the entire eastern seaboard. But a legacy is a fragile thing. It is not made of brick and mortar. It is made of truth. It is made of integrity. and it can be easily poisoned by those who value the illusion of success over the discipline of actual hard work. I glanced down at this floor level. Vivian had somehow managed to unfreeze her legs. She was actively moving closer to the front of the stage, positioning herself directly in the center of the photographer's sightlines. She was adjusting her silver-beaded gown and putting on her perfectly practiced, humble smile. In Vivian's deeply narcissistic mind, my sudden appearance in an expensive dress was just a bizarre stunt. She truly believed Josephine was giving a speech about legacy to prepare the crowd for the ultimate transition of power. Vivian thought this was her coronation. She thought she was about to be named the head of the Washington Empire. I have spent the last few months evaluating the future of my holdings. Josephine continued, her eyes sweeping over the crowd. I have looked closely at the people who stand to inherit the weight of this family name. I have seen what happens when greed disguises itself as ambition. I have seen the rot that festers when people prioritize designer labels and country club dues over the survival of their own flesh and blood. Vivian's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, but she quickly plastered it back on. She nodded along, pretending Josephine was talking about abstract business competitors instead of her own daughter. Chloe was standing right behind Vivian, clutching her stolen Cartier bag, staring up at the stage with a look of mounting dread. Preston was sweating profusely, actively dabbing his forehead with a cocktail napkin. To protect a legacy, you do not hand it to the loudest person in the room, Josephine declared, her voice rising in power and volume. You hand it to the person who knows how to survive the fire. You hand it to a master of numbers, a woman of unbroken character. You hand it to someone who was pushed to the absolute brink of destruction and responded by analyzing the data and outsmarting her predators. Josephine turned away from the crowd and looked directly at me. That is why tonight, I am not just celebrating my past. I am officially announcing the future. I am announcing the immediate restructuring of the Washington estate and all associated real estate holding companies. Vivian took a deep breath, ready to step forward and graciously accept the applause. She actually lifted her hand to wave. Effective immediately, Josephine announced, her voice booming through the sound system, I am stepping down, and I am naming my granddaughter, Gabrielle Washington, as the sole executor of the Washington estate and the new chief executive officer of the Washington Enterprise. The applause did not start immediately. The shock was too profound. I stepped forward, joining my grandmother at the podium. I looked directly down at Vivian. I watched the coronation she had dreamed of for decades turn into an execution. The polished, humble smile physically shattered on her face. Her jaw dropped open, and a guttural sound of pure denial escaped her throat. The silver-beaded gown suddenly looked like a cheap costume on a woman who had just been completely stripped of her power. She raised a shaking hand, pointing a finger at me, as if trying to cast a spell to make me disappear. Chloe let out a sharp, terrified gasp, backing away from the stage as if it were rigged with explosives. Preston looked like he was going to be physically sick, his eyes darting frantically toward the exit doors. They knew exactly what this meant. I was not just a disgraced auditor anymore. I was not the family scapegoat begging for formula money in a steakhouse. I was the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar empire. I held the keys to the kingdom, and I was the one holding all the receipts to their federal crimes. The ballroom finally erupted. It was not polite applause. It was a roar of astonishment, murmurs of shock, and the frantic snapping of camera shutters. The influential guests were rapidly processing the brutal shift in the family hierarchy. They were looking at Vivian standing frozen and humiliated on the floor, and then looking up at me standing radiant and untouchable in emerald silk. I placed my hands on the edges of the crystal podium and leaned into the microphone. Thank you, Grandma, I said, my voice perfectly steady, cutting through the noise of the crowd. I promise to audit every single asset in this family portfolio with absolute ruthless precision. I will ensure that the Washington name is completely cleansed of fraud, theft, and anyone who attempts to exploit our legacy. I stared right into my mother's terrified eyes as I said the word fraud. I let her see the absolute certainty of her impending destruction. The trap had officially snapped shut, but the public execution was only half over. Now it was time to show Atlanta exactly how the former golden child and the performative matriarch funded their lavish lifestyle. Vivian snapped. The sheer terror of losing her status completely overrode whatever remaining rational thought she possessed. She relied on the only playbook she had ever known. She hiked up the heavy beaded skirt of her silver gown and practically sprinted up the side stairs of the stage. Her heels clicked frantically against the wood as she lunged toward a secondary microphone positioned near a grand piano. She gripped the microphone stand with white knuckles and let out a loud, hysterical laugh. It was a manic, grating sound that echoed uncomfortably through the grand ballroom. She pasted on a desperate manicured smile and turned to the sea of elite guests. "Please forgive this bizarre interruption," Vivian announced, her voice shrill and trembling with forced amusement. "As you can see, my eldest daughter is deeply unwell. She recently suffered a severe mental breakdown, and her postpartum depression has clearly caused a complete detachment from reality. We are trying to get her the psychiatric help she desperately needs. Josephine is just playing along to pacify her delusions. Please ignore this tragic outburst." She looked back at me and Josephine, expecting us to cower. She expected her high society friends to nod in sympathetic agreement and help her sweep my existence back under the rug. She thought her words still held power. Josephine did not even blink. She simply raised her hand and snapped her fingers toward the elevated tech booth at the back of the ballroom. Vivian's microphone went dead instantly. She tapped the grill frantically, shouting into the dead device, but her voice was completely swallowed by the sheer size of the room. Then the ballroom lights dimmed. The massive 20-foot projector screens flanking the stage, which had been running a tasteful slideshow of my grandmother's life, suddenly flickered. The soft piano music accompanying the slideshow cut out sharply. The screens transitioned from sepia-toned family portraits to stark, high-resolution documents. I had spent hours formatting these slides for maximum devastating clarity. The first image to illuminate the darkened ballroom was the official wire transfer request for my son, $250,000 trust fund. The document was magnified to 20 feet tall, making Vivian-forged digital signature and the diverted routing numbers impossible to miss. A thick red digital arrow connected Vivian's signature directly to the receiving shell account. A collective gasp ripped through the audience. These were not casual observers. This room was filled with hedge fund managers, corporate lawyers, and federal judges. They did not need a translation. They recognized a structured embezzlement scheme the exact second it flashed across the screen. The slides shifted in rapid, merciless succession. Click. The bank statements showing the stolen funds being broken down into increments of $12,000 and $8,500, bypassing automated fraud detection. Click. The State Business Registry, proving Sterling Innovation Partners, LLC, was a phantom corporation with zero active revenue, receiving the stolen trust funds directly from Vivian's shell account. Click. The credit card statements. This was the masterstroke. The screen displayed the $80,000 of fraudulent debt opened under my stolen Social Security number. Side by side with the credit statements were time-stamped photographs pulled directly from Chloe-owned social media accounts. The entire ballroom looked at a $12,000 charge at the Cartier boutique, right next to a massive projection of Chloe posing with that exact black leather Panther bag. The whispers on the floor escalated into a roar of absolute revulsion. I watched the elite crowd physically recoil from where Chloe and Preston were standing. Chloe frantically tried to hide the Cartier bag behind her back, her face completely flushed with shame. She looked like a cornered animal, realizing that every single wealthy peer she worshipped was currently staring at the undeniable proof of her federal crimes. Preston was experiencing his own personal apocalypse. The billionaire investors he had been aggressively pitching just moments ago were now glaring at him with pure, unadulterated disgust. The commercial developer Preston had cornered earlier pulled out his phone and actively stepped away, brushing his suit jacket as if Preston had infected him. Preston's fake tech empire had just been exposed as a parasitic money laundering operation in front of every major venture capitalist in the Southeast. Vivian stood frozen on the stage, trapped between the damning evidence on the screens and the horrified faces of her precious high society friends. The illusion she had drained her own bank accounts to protect was completely obliterated in less than 60 seconds. Josephine leaned back into her live microphone. The ambient noise in the room instantly died down as the matriarch delivered the final unsparing blow. My daughter and my granddaughter stole $250,000 from a newborn baby to fund a lie, Josephine's voice boomed through the silent room, vibrating with a wrath that shook the crystal chandeliers. They evicted a pregnant woman into the freezing winter. They committed federal identity theft to buy designer bags and fake their way into your social circles. They brought unimaginable shame to the Washington name. Josephine turned to look directly at Vivian. The disgust in my grandmother's eyes was absolute. "You are no longer family," Josephine declared, her words striking like physical blows. "You are thieves. You are entirely disinherited. And you are trespassing." Vivian's knees finally gave out. She collapsed onto the polished stage, her heavy silver-beaded gown pooling around her like a puddle of liquid metal. She covered her face with her hands, letting out a loud, ragged sob of pure defeat. There was no recovery from this. There was no gaslighting her way out of high-resolution bank fraud projected in front of the mayor. The scapegoat had not just fought back. The scapegoat had executed a flawless corporate dismantling and left their remains for the vultures. I stood tall beside my grandmother, the emerald silk of my gown catching the glow of the projector screens. I looked down at Vivian weeping on the floor, then out at Chloe and Preston trembling in the center of the hostile crowd. The reign of the golden child was officially over. Now it was time for the authorities to clean up the wreckage. The fallout in the ballroom was absolute and instantaneous. Atlanta high society does not tolerate messy public scandals, and they certainly do not tolerate thieves who steal from their own blood. The physical revulsion in the room was a masterclass in social execution. I stood on the stage and watched the wealthy elite collectively turn their backs on my mother and sister. It was a synchronized, silent excommunication. Down on the floor, Preston was scrambling. He grabbed the arm of Marcus Hayes, the commercial developer he had been aggressively pitching all night. Marcus did not just pull away. He pulled his phone from his breast pocket, maintained unblinking eye contact with Preston, and explicitly dialed his wealth management team. I watched Marcus instruct his people to immediately halt any pending capital transfers to Sterling Innovation Partners and to flag Preston across their entire corporate network. The other venture capitalists in the circle followed suit, tapping on their screens to permanently block Preston and his contact information. In less than 2 minutes, his entire financial future was systematically deleted. Chloe was faring no better. The socialite influencers she had desperately tried to impress were actively stepping away from her, holding their designer gowns tightly against their legs. They looked at her $10,000 Cartier bag, not with envy, but with pure disgust, knowing it was bought with a stolen identity and a starving infant money. Chloe started to hyperventilate, her perfectly styled hair falling into her tear-streaked face. Josephine raised her hand again, giving a sharp nod to the back of the room. The private security team, comprised entirely of off-duty police officers, moved in with tactical precision. 2 officers ascended the stage and hauled Vivian to her feet. My mother screamed, kicking her silver heels against the polished wood, demanding they unhand her. She shrieked that she was the matriarch of the family and demanded respect. The officers simply gripped her arms tighter and physically dragged her down the side stairs. On the floor, another squad of officers flanked Chloe and Preston. Chloe burst into loud, ugly sobs, begging her former friends for help. Nobody moved a single muscle. The silence of the crowd was a deafening endorsement of their removal. Preston tried to puff out his chest and argue with the guards, but a firm hand on his collar immediately shattered his fake bravado. The 3 of them were corralled together and marched out of the grand ballroom in a humiliating, highly public perp walk. The heavy mahogany doors slammed shut behind them, severing them from the world of luxury they had sacrificed my son to access. But the social execution was merely the appetizer. The main course was served at exactly 6 o'clock the following morning. I was sitting in my grandmother's private kitchen, sipping hot coffee and feeding Elijah, when Josephine, lead attorney, called with the update. The trap had not just sprung, it had completely shattered their reality. Armed with the massive digital dossier I had compiled, The federal authorities did not waste a single second. A fleet of black SUVs and marked police cruisers descended on the pristine Buckhead mansion. Federal agents and local authorities breached the front doors before Vivian even had time to wash off her smeared gala makeup. They executed high-level search warrants, dragging out boxes of financial documents, laptops, and the stolen luxury goods Chloe had hoarded. The attorney sent me the live feed footage captured by the local news helicopters hovering over the neighborhood. I watched my screen with absolute icy satisfaction as my family was marched out of their fake palace. Vivian was crying hysterically, wearing a silk bathrobe, her wrists securely bound in heavy zip ties. She was screaming at the cameras, completely unhinged. Chloe was dragged out next, shivering in the morning cold, completely unrecognizable from the glamorous woman at the gala. She was sobbing so hard she could barely walk. The federal agents had seized the Cartier bag right off her vanity. Finally, Preston was hauled down the driveway by two massive agents. He looked incredibly small, pathetic, and terrified. There was no smug tech bro smirk, no condescending lecture about pulling himself up by his bootstraps. He was a fraud facing the brutal reality of the federal justice system. They were all loaded into the backs of separate squad cars. The charges were ironclad: aggravated identity theft, wire fraud, and grand embezzlement. The empire of lies Vivian had built to impress Atlanta high society had collapsed in a spectacular, highly publicized federal raid. They traded my peace of mind for luxury, and now they were going to trade their luxury for a concrete cell. The loyalty among thieves evaporates the exact second the handcuffs click shut. Inside the federal holding facility, Preston did not even wait for his appointed attorney to arrive before he completely turned on my sister. The arrogant tech visionary crumbled into a weeping coward in the interrogation room. He immediately threw Chloe under the bus, telling federal agents that she handled all their personal finances, and that he had been entirely tricked into believing the trust fund transfers were legitimate angel investments. By noon, he had his lawyer file for divorce, hoping to legally sever himself from her sinking ship. But Preston was arrogant enough to forget who built the financial dossier against him. I had mapped every single IP address and digital signature. The federal prosecutors laughed in his face when he claimed ignorance, pointing out that his personal digital authorization was stamped on every single fraudulent corporate transfer. His cowardly betrayal did nothing but guarantee that both he and Chloe were indicted on all counts. They are currently sitting in separate federal detention centers, facing up to 20 years in prison for grand embezzlement and identity theft. There are no silk robes or imported wines where they are going. Vivian suffered a fate that in her eyes was far worse than a prison cell. She was stripped of her wealth and her carefully curated social status. To satisfy the massive financial restitution ordered by the courts to repay my stolen identity and Elijah Trust Fund, the authorities seized absolutely everything she owned. The bank foreclosed on the Buckhead mansion. Her luxury vehicles were towed away in the middle of the night. Her designer wardrobe was liquidated. The Atlanta high society she worshipped completely banished her. When she tried to call her wealthy friends for bail money or a place to stay, every single number went straight to voicemail. She is currently living in a cheap rundown motel on the outskirts of the city, surviving on a meager fixed income. The woman who once evicted her pregnant daughter into the freezing cold now spends her days staring at peeling wallpaper, completely erased from the elite circles she sacrificed her own flesh and blood to impress. As the dust settled, Malik finally came to see me. He did not come with grand excuses or defensive arguments. He showed up at Josephine Estate completely broken, weeping, as he fell to his knees in the foyer. He begged for my forgiveness, apologizing for letting his pride and Vivian Vicious lies blind him to my truth. He asked me to take him back to rebuild the family we had dreamed of. I looked at the man I deeply loved, the father of my child, and I felt a profound ache in my chest. But a successful auditor knows that an account heavily overdrawn cannot be restored with a single apology. I told Malik that I forgave him, but I did not take him back immediately. I set strict, unbreakable boundaries. I told him he had full access to be a devoted, loving father to Elijah. He could be present for every milestone, every doctor appointment, and every bedtime story. But my heart was a completely different jurisdiction. I told him he would have to spend the next few years proving his loyalty and rebuilding my trust from the absolute ground up. He nodded, accepting the terms without hesitation, grateful just to be allowed back into the same room as his son. My life looks entirely different now. The freezing studio apartment and the desperate hunger are nothing but distant memories. I am currently sitting in the sprawling corner office of the Washington Enterprise Building. The floor-to-ceiling glass windows offer a breathtaking panoramic view of the entire Atlanta skyline. Elijah is sleeping peacefully in a custom nursery attached to my office, his future secured permanently by the massive trust fund I personally manage. I run a multi-billion-dollar real estate empire with the same cold calculating precision I used to dismantle the people who tried to destroy me. I look out over the city, tracing the bustling streets and towering skyscrapers. I think about my mother and my sister plotting in their expensive mansion, believing they could easily crush the family workhorse. They thought they could throw me into a shallow grave and cover it with their lies. But they made a fatal miscalculation. I did not just survive their attempt to bury me. The most profound lesson from this journey is that your worth is never defined by the people who try to break you, even if they share your blood. Toxic relatives often exploit loyalty and use your silence as a weapon. However, true power does not come from sinking to their level of cruelty. It comes from trusting your own strength, maintaining absolute integrity, and using your skills to reclaim your narrative. When toxic people try to bury you under their lies, they forget that seeds thrive in the dark. The ultimate justice is becoming relentlessly successful and unshakably free. If you have ever had to cut ties with a toxic family member to protect your peace, share your story in the comments below and subscribe to our channel for more empowering journeys of reclaiming your worth.